good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Love seeing these attendance lists explode. Welcome to all of you. We'll give it a couple of minutes here, just 1 or 2 minutes to let more people roll in. But if you could, go ahead and join the Nearpod session that we have for today. I just put it into the chat. You can either click the link that is shared or go to nearpod.com and type in the code PR7WZ or Z for our UK folks here. So yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. If you're just rolling in, if you could join the Nearpod lesson, we will turn it over to Gavin momentarily. Hello, Yulia. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon again. As you come in, just join in that Nearpod lesson. We'll get started here momentarily. Just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to roll in and join the Nearpod. Go ahead and drop that in the chat again. And there's the code again. Hello, hello, everyone. For all of our Star Wars fans out there, happy May the 4th. Good morning from Maryland, fellow East Coaster. We have people from all time zones joining this one, so it's going to be a good afternoon or even good evening for some people and a very early morning for some others. Hello from the UK, Indiana. Oh, I love it, guys. Hello, hello. Okay, so we're officially 2 minutes in. So I'll put the chat in here, or the Nearpod link in here again. So if you could just join that Nearpod for us. Gavin has a lot of really fantastic content for us today, and a lot of really great ideas of how Nearpod can be used in a higher education atmosphere. So definitely please go ahead and join that Nearpod so you can participate along. It is going to be a engaging and interactive presentation, so you'll want to make sure that you are in the Nearpod. Yulia, yes, you join as students. And then, yes, to the question about recordings. So we are recording this session. When it's completed, we'll be sending it out to everyone who has joined and those who have registered for the webinar and weren't able to join. So as long as you registered and you're here, you'll get the recording. All right, I'll go ahead and add this in one more time. All right, so now I would like to introduce our fantastic guest, Gavin Knight. Gavin is a principal lecturer at the University of Portsmouth. He has been a fantastic partner and a Nearpod advocate that we've really had the honor and pleasure to work with. He is the principal lecturer in hematology, a course leader for the IBMS and so Royal Society of Biology accredited BSc Honors Program, the Biomedical Science course. He's a program leader for the Biomedical Sciences area and Technology Enhanced Learning lead for the School of Pharmacy and Biomedical Sciences. And his area of academic interest, area of specialist academic interest, focuses on hematological malignancies and the molecular mechanisms underpinning their behavior. So this is going to be a really great demonstration of how Nearpod can be rolled out at high levels in academia. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Gavin. Gavin, thanks for joining.
Oh, thanks ever so much, Zach, for the introduction. It's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? It sounds better than I think it actually is, but we'll skate over that for now, I think. So welcome everyone to my session. I'm really pleased that you could all join me today. I'm just going to talk about some of the ways in which I use Nearpod for our undergraduate students in biomedical science. But I'm also going to talk about how we use it for our apprentices as well. And I'll come on to that in a moment. So a little bit more about me, although I think you've had quite the introduction already. So I'm a biomedical scientist by training. So I used to work in the National Health Service before joining university about 18 years ago. And I worked my way up from lecturer, senior lecturer to principal lecturer and a course leader for biomedical sciences. I'm now the program leader, so I look after not only the BSc Hons in biomedical science, I also support the course leader for our degree apprenticeship in applied biomedical science and our course leader for the MSc in medical biotechnology as well. So my remit is quite broad, but I am really passionate about a couple of things, in particular to do with higher education. One of them is student-centered learning and getting students to be the center of their learning experience. And the other is technology-enhanced learning. I should probably say actually collaborative learning is really high on my agenda, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So I'm a Health and Care Profession Council registered biomedical scientist, and I've kept up my registration so I could, God forbid, work in the NHS again, although I'm sure they probably wouldn't want me after all this time. But one of the things I really want to talk about today is how I use active learning approaches centered around Nearpod in order to engage our students. For anyone who's not familiar with hematology and what it is, it's the study of blood and trying to understand how to diagnose diseases associated with the blood and to understand what happens when blood stops working properly. So just want to talk a little bit about the pedagogies that I use quite a lot. And you can see there are 5 main approaches here, and I've got hyflex there as my 6th one, and I'll talk about that in a second. What this slide really demonstrates is a number of the pedagogic approaches that we've used, particularly in the last few years. So the image at the center of the circle there is COVID, the COVID virus, and then really the impact that that's had on a number of our different teaching approaches. And so what we have at the top is blended, and I think our blended approach to learning and teaching has increased quite possibly exponentially over the last few years, where we've tried to engage students both remotely and face-to-face when it's been permitted to do so. So blending of learning and teaching using different sorts of online and face-to-face platforms has been really important as part of that. As I mentioned previously, I'm really passionate about collaborative learning. I like getting students together, talking to one another, trying to solve problems. What I find interesting about that approach is how you see students go into a session with one idea, and by having to talk to other students, by having to defend their perspective, to develop and redevelop their ideas, you get really significant learning as part of that process. It changes their perspective on their subject. And so I love to see that process happening. And so we've got a couple of modules that are developed around collaborative learning. And myself and my colleagues work hard to ensure students have a good experience with that. Kind of alongside that, we've got problem-based learning and case-based learning approaches. And case-based learning is something that's going to feature quite strongly within this Nearpod presentation today. I'm also a big fan of authentic assessment. So it's not just about the whole alignment process between assessments and the learning outcomes of the module, although I know that's incredibly important. It's making sure that students have meaningful assessment as well. You're not just assessing them for the sake of it, but it's that actually the real world assessment styles are coming into play. So students are applying their knowledge and you're just not regurgitating facts. And then finally, we've got hyflex. And hyflex is something that really we introduced, particularly within my area of biomedical sciences, to cater for our apprentices. So our apprenticeship course for applied biomedical science is actually relatively small. We have around about 120 students per year for our biomedical science program. And we have probably about 6 to 9 students per year for our apprenticeship. And certainly at the end of our final lockdown last year, we ended up in a position, well, earlier this year, we ended up in a position where our apprentices were back on site for perhaps the first time in their academic careers. And they were scared. You know, they work in the NHS, they work in the labs, they're responsible for, you know, testing samples, diagnosing disease, monitoring patients to see if therapies are working. And they were really worried about being on site with, you know, in a room with 120 other students and potentially catching COVID or something else. So we had a long chat with the students where they were talking about their concerns, and we came to a compromise that we would try something a little bit different. We didn't want them to be completely remote, but we wanted them to still engage as part of the university community. Community is really important to us. So I said to them I'd try a hyflex approach, and I'd had a meeting before one of my sessions. Some people had dialed in because they weren't comfortable coming in. Some people were face to face. So I said, well, you know, now's as good a time as any. Let's give it a go. So I tried a hyflex approach. I did a Zoom recording whilst teaching, which in itself isn't particularly unique. The fairly, well, it's not really unique in itself, but the relatively novel part of it was I used Nearpod for the process. So when I'm teaching, as you'll see from the next slide, I tend to use a flipped classroom approach where the students have materials up front and then they apply that using Nearpod in the live sessions. And that's really what most of this presentation is based upon. And so I used Nearpod for this hyflex approach. And had I thought about it too much, I might have backed away from the idea, but I didn't think about it very much at all. I just ran with the idea, and actually it proved to be a really, really popular approach for our apprentices. And because we were using Nearpod, because the whole sessions were applied, it meant that students could engage regardless of where they were, whether in hospital, whether they're at home, whether they're in the university, and they were all sharing the same platforms. They all had a shared experience. And so that proved to be really, really popular. The university itself doesn't really support hyflex. You know, we feel we should do one thing for one group, and if it doesn't work for another, then we should provide something different. But these were fairly unique circumstances, and I feel that Nearpod really, really helped give remote students an equivalent experience to those that were face to face. So we ran with it, and it worked really, really well. And more on the sorts of questions and things that we use a little bit later on. And the clock there on the left-hand side really signifies a real shift in the timing of evolving our course. So all the things that we're doing now since COVID were on my wish list. I wanted to do them. I've wanted to do them for years, but we haven't been in the right place to do it. We haven't had the technical resource. We haven't had the Wi-Fi strength. We haven't had the Zoom, and because of COVID, all of these things have come to the fore, have become available. And so it's probably accelerated the way in which we were planning to develop and deliver our course by about a decade, I would say, in all fairness. We're fairly moving. We're like an oil tanker on water sometimes with the way in which we move. And so COVID really provided that opportunity for us to change our pedagogy, to change our approach, and to do something quite special with our program. And a lot of that does relate to how I use Nearpod at the very least. So the way I use Nearpod is kind of demonstrated in this slide here. So first of all, I'll do a series of recordings. I've got here as an example, maybe I'll do 4 15-minute recordings. Those will be done by Panopto. I might do multiples of those. So I might have 8 15-minute recordings, for example, depending on how much I want to talk about the subject more than anything else. And so those will be very discreetly produced. Each recording will have its own learning outcomes. It will have its own schedule. It will have its own conclusion. And so it forms a discrete unit in its own right. To maintain accessibility, all of those recordings are subtitled as well, and they're put onto our virtual learning environment, which is Moodle. So students will work through these recordings as part of a Moodle lesson. And then once they've got to the end of those, they'll have a variety of activities that they'll need to engage with. So they might have to interact with some MCQs or some other kind of quizzing type activities. They might need to do a little bit of wider reading. The quiz might become before or after that. And then I'll carefully select some videos, most commonly from YouTube, which represent the disease processes that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about using lectures from other people and what they've done, but I'm talking about case studies. So quite often, if you search properly on YouTube, you find some really good case studies about people's experience of living with a particular disease. And that to me is really important. So I see it as my job to paint the picture, to talk about the pathology, how the disease works, how we diagnose it, what sort of impact it has on patients and their lifestyle, and potentially their survival as well. And then I use these short, sharp clips, 2 or 3 minutes a piece, of these real life experiences that patients have. They are from bona fide resources. And I use those then to set the context. So one of the key things I think that our Dean of Digital Learning, Ale Armelini, talks about is content isn't king, context is. And it's something that I've taken on board and I've used for some time. We need to set the context for what students are learning to make them understand why they need to know what they need to know. So those short videos really allow us to set that context so students can see why they're learning what they're learning. And so all of this in the first blue box there is asynchronous. So they do that up front. Then moving outside of the asynchronous box, then I'll run my live session. And so students will have on their timetable maybe a 2-hour session with me where it's based purely in Nearpod, where we run through clinical cases, more on those in a moment, and we look at how biomedical science influences the way in which those clinical cases are managed. Those sessions are recorded, so I'll record those, and then that recording will be published to Moodle, and also the student-paced Nearpod will be published to Moodle as well. So students can either have a go on their own to work through the case, or they can watch the video and then they can see how the case has evolved over the period of that 2 hours. And they look at my narrative that goes alongside that as well. And that's proved to be a really, really popular approach. So using it for both synchronous and asynchronous purposes in the context of this blended and connected approach that we've been using since COVID has really proved incredibly fruitful and has been very popular with our students as well. When we've had our middle module questionnaires at the end of the modules or midterm questionnaires, for my modules, students invariably do say, what an excellent experience they've had because of that engagement they've had via Nearpod. That's not to sound amazing, but they do like the interaction through Nearpod, so that works really well. So the way I set up my room, it looks like there are lots and lots of people there in the audience. These days, it might not be quite so packed, and that's a disproportionately sized computer for anyone who's paying particular attention. But the way I set it up is pretty much how I'm doing it today. So I'll have my master slides, my master Nearpod presentation, which will be on my iPad. And then I'll log in on the computer into Nearpod, and then I'll put my code in there. So what students are seeing on the projector on the big screen is what they're seeing on their own devices. And that's important because what I've noticed over time is that not all students who attend the session will engage with Nearpod on their own device. They might pair up, they might talk, they might share ideas, they might publish, one between two. Some people won't have a device that they use, but I don't want them to be excluded. I want them to have an inclusive experience. So I make sure that whatever I'm presenting on my slides, the students get to see the student view on the big screen as well. And that's important because not only does it mean that their privacy is protected, other students aren't seeing the identity of whoever's posted and shared things with me, but it also means that people can engage regardless of whether they actually want to dial in themselves or not. So that's the kind of approach I use. And again, that's proved to be very popular amongst other staff within my department, but also with the students as well. So what we're seeing here is just a small number of the clinical case studies that I've created. So each one of these clinical cases here has got a name. And I find it really important to use identity as part of my case studies. So I'll use unsplash or copyright free images wherever possible within my all the time within my presentations. I try to give the patient identity, because that's the best way of students being able to learn and to understand that at the end of every specimen that they receive within a lab, there is a patient at the end of it. And so it kind of keeps the context real. It makes them understand that there is a patient involved in all of these, even though these are fictitious patients. You'll see that some of these patients have got a little bit of biography on the front slide. Others have got them a little bit later on slide 2. It's kind of an evolving process. So it's a little bit of a mixture at the moment. But this is just a screen capture of some of those patients that I've created over the last year or two. And the way it works, it's a pretty much standardized format, and that's shown by this thread here. So we start off with the patient background. We'll look at how the patient presents, whether it's to a GP, emergency department, a nurse, whoever it happens to be as a healthcare professional. And they have a variety of signs and symptoms which the students will need to try to understand and link to the pathology. Then we move into the investigations that are shown there in blue. I've just put 3 as an example. It's often a lot more than that. And that's the bit where the real application comes in. So students are required to interpret data. So interpret raw data to understand what it means, to put it into context. And again, that's the context is king aspect of all of this. It's not just about the content, but it's what students can do with it. And ultimately, they'll need to then figure out how all of this fits together to identify what treatment the patient needs and what the prognosis is for that patient as well. And that's the general theme that we run throughout my sessions using Nearpod. So in terms of my favorite Nearpod activities, I've got quite a lot that I use. So I'll use a lot of the different activities that are available, but I do have my favorites. And the ones that I'm going to demonstrate to you are shown in the blue box here. So I particularly like the Draw It. I use that an awful lot. And I also use the open answer, the open-ended questions one as well. The Draw It is important because it means that students can annotate a lot, and that's exactly what I get them to do. And I've got some examples of how I do that in a few moments. And the open-ended question tool is quite useful because it allows me to train students in how to answer exam questions. And so that doesn't mean to say that I give them a really long, complex question they need to solve, but it does mean that I get to give them the opportunity to try to decode what a question is asking of them, to identify the key terms and the action terms, and to write a short answer that really fits the remit of what that question is asking. And that's really important, certainly since COVID struck and we've moved away from that typical face-to-face that we had pre-COVID, where students were doing lots of seated exams. They kind of seem to have lost the ability to be able to answer exam questions properly. And it's probably not surprising given that, their A-levels and other access courses were disrupted through COVID. And so they're lacking that ability to be able to answer questions properly. And so again, using Nearpod, I use this as a tool to encourage students to think about exam style questions and how they might answer those. So I also use polls, I use quizzes as well to varying extents according to the needs of the session. But certainly Draw It and open-ended questions are the way that I tend to use Nearpod. So let me give you an example. So what we've got here is, as a hematologist, this is kind of bread and butter stuff to me, and to my students. So one of the principal tests that we use within hematology is the full blood count. It's the cornerstone test that everyone at some point will have taken. And so you get a single tube of blood taken from the arm, and then that's analyzed on a machine to give you a series of results. And what you can see here, if I just move the instructions out the way, is the parameters. These are the analytes on the left-hand side. We've got the patient results, which are a second left. we would compare those results to the second right, the reference range section, and then we've got the units then in the penultimate column there. So we've got all the information that we need. So what I would ask students to do, and I'm going to ask you to do the same thing now within the audience, is to just use the drawing tool to indicate for me which results are normal, i.e. they fit within the reference range, they're high, so they're above the upper limit of the reference range, or they're low and they're below the lower limit of the reference range. So I know time's getting on a little bit. So if I give you, say, 2 minutes, could you use the drawing tool and then share your answer with me via the submit button on the bottom right to just show how you've interacted with this Nearpod slide? So you can either use the drawing tool, which is the blue disc in the bottom corner there with a pen on it, or if you wanted to use a text box, you could use that as well, just to indicate high, low, or normal for me. Arrows work very well as well. So over to you. So the nice thing about using this approach is I'm able to look at my iPad now without you knowing what I'm looking at. And I can see that, you know, so far no one submitted any answers, but hopefully that will change. I've got an answer. Hey, thank you. So I can see then that people are engaging with this. What I have noticed over time is, and I talked about this in a session I ran last week, is particularly pre-COVID, I did encounter something I refer to as Nearpod apathy. And that's where, you know, if you use I found in my experience, if you use Nearpod too much, then students will start to disengage. And there's this kind of sweet spot I found where if you use it just the right amount, you maintain engagement and students see the value of, you know, chipping away at the problem. But if you use it too much, then they start to disengage with it, and then it becomes a real effort to get them to continue. So, you know, I do work hard, and I'm quite a reflective individual as well. So I think about, you know, how students have reacted to my session, and then I try to make changes there and then, you know, after the session, so that for the next time I run it, then, you know, it's had that in mind, that evolutionary process. So I've got some answers coming in. That's absolutely brilliant. And it's really interesting because, I mean, looking at the data that I've got here coming through, it's just amazing the number of ways that people choose how to annotate their slides. So I've got, you know, up arrows, I've got down arrows, I've got ends for normal, I've got circles, I've got color coding, you know, all sorts of things. So that's absolutely brilliant. But because time's getting on, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop and I'm just going to share one of my slides. I've not checked to see whether it's right or not. I normally would do before I go through the process of sharing. So what we can see here is a really nice example. I've chosen this one because it's really punchy. It stands out really nicely. Green ticks signify things, results that are within the reference range. A blue L is where it's low, and a red H is where it's high. So that's fantastic. So we can see here a really nice pattern has emerged, and quite rightly we've got the hemoglobin level is within the reference range. That's is below the reference range. The white cell count is very high, so WBC is very high compared to the reference range. Neutrophils and lymphocytes are high as well. So that's fantastic. So that would be the start of the journey. If I come out of this a second and I go back to the question, as an extension activity, I'd ask the students to then use the correct terminology to describe the pattern of results that the students have identified. So with a low hemoglobin, a low red cell count, we would expect the students to use the word anemia, for example, in order to say, yeah, this patient is anemic. We would expect students to say, okay, when there's a high white cell count, we call that leukocytosis. And so it's, again, reinforcing the use of the correct, you know, professional terminology that's used to describe these results. And so, again, it's all about giving formative feedback to students and making sure that they understand where they're going right, but they also understand when it's not working so well and they need to go and, you know, put some more effort into their studies. So I find this a really useful tool to be able to achieve that. One of the key benefits of using this kind of approach, where I'm focusing on clinical case studies, and to be fair, you know, biomedicine is really suited to using a case study based approach. It's not the only discipline to allow you to do that, of course, but it means that, you know, every session is a formative session. So when we get, you know, end of year feedback and students say, oh, I've not had any opportunities for formative feedback, well, you've had every opportunity for formative feedback, because every single session that we've run using Nearpod is based on formative feedback. You're getting formative feedback each and every time we have a discussion about the results that you've posted. And so it leads to a really, really rich learning environment. Moving on. So I've got another one. So I'll ask you to just have a quick look at this one as well. So this is a different case. This is a case of Bashir now, and we've got a sample of blood that's been used to make a blood film. So one of the things that I love about hematology is that you get to deal with numbers, and you've seen those as part of the full blood count, but we also get to look down the microscope, and we get to look at sometimes some really, really beautiful images of patient cells. And you can see exactly what's going on inside that patient's body. You can really understand how the pathology is affecting the patient and how the patient is responding to that pathology as well. So what we have here is a couple of images. So on the left-hand side, we've got a normal specimen, and on the right-hand side, we've got a specimen from Bashir, and a blood film has been made for him. So what I would ask students to do, and I'll just ask you to pop in a couple of ideas here as well, again using the drawing tools, is just indicate what sort of things you can identify from Bashir's sample. The premise that I usually use is a say what you see kind of approach. And that's something that I always use when working with microscopy. Say what you see, identify the features first of all, and we can work on everything else from there. If you can't identify abnormalities, then, you know, it's pointless learning the terminology. You need to be able to understand what the abnormalities are first of all. So if I hand over to you for, let's say, another couple of minutes, could you just point out to me some of the differences between Bashir's sample and the normal one? Of course, I don't expect the terminology to be used, but just what sort of things are you identifying there that are different between the two? I absolutely love this. Looking at some of the comments here, they are absolutely amazing. And you know what? They are really, really observant. And part of the challenge here is getting students to be observant. And a lot will just look at it and think, I just don't know what to write. You know, I don't know what to say about it. And there are obvious differences between the two. They just don't necessarily know how to highlight those differences effectively. And so, I mean, I've got some lovely comments here. I mean, they really are fantastic. So, I mean, we've got things like less visible cell. Oh, we've got a scientist here. So less visible cells, smaller main nucleolus, varied shapes. So as one of the comments. I've got something here that says fewer cells in Bashir's sample. That's brilliant. Yes, that's perfect. Fewer cells, abnormally shaped. Less round blood cells, more purple matter. So, you know, there are some such lovely comments here that are absolutely right. Let's see. Oh, okay, I've definitely got a hematologist here somewhere. So someone identifying sickle cells and cells with reduced red cell density. And we've got things like, oh, we've got some purple blobs here. And we've got arrows as well. So everything in between. So it's fantastic. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to share. Which one should I share? It's really difficult to decide here what to share. Decisions. I don't know. I think I might share. I'm going to share this one. So here we go. They're all perfect in their own way. So here we've identified there are cells where there are smaller nuclear features. There are a fewer cells there than in the one on the left-hand side. Some of them are malformed. That's absolutely perfect. I mean, what we're dealing with here is a patient who's got sickle cell disease. So he's got an abnormal type of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a molecule that's a respiratory pigment. It transports oxygen around the body to metabolizing tissue. It transports carbon dioxide from that metabolizing tissue to the lungs to be exhaled. And when you get a single mutation within the structure of within the structure of the hemoglobin molecule, and it's a particular mutation, hemoglobin, rather than being soluble, becomes insoluble under certain conditions, and it lines up and forms a polymer. So it forms like a rope, and that bends the shape of the red blood cell into the sickle cell shapes that you've got on the right hand side here. So these elongated cells with the pointy edges are sickle cells from a patient that's got sickle cell disease. We've got cells here that have got a slightly bluish coloration to them. So if you compare the cells on the right-hand side to the ones on the left, some of those cells that have got this bluish coloration to them are relatively immature red blood cells. Blood cells of all types are produced within the bone marrow, and they're released as and when they're needed. And red blood cells, which are the ones that are red there, will appear a bluish color when they've been freshly released from the bone marrow. The cell on the right-hand side with a very small nucleus is a really immature red blood cell that has still got a nucleus in place. So when red blood cells are produced, they don't have a nucleus. That nucleus is removed before they enter the peripheral blood. And that allows the red blood cells to bend, twist, and squeeze through very small vessels. So that tells us an awful lot about the pathology here. And by using Nearpod, we can tell a story just with a single image about what's going on inside the patient and what further tests we would need to conduct in order to try to make a definitive diagnosis and identify how to treat the patient. So that's really, really good. I'll move on. Again, we've got Bashir's analysis. I'm going to just move my instructions out the way to show you this one. So part of the diagnosis of sickle cell disease is to get students to understand the different types of tests, the different types of data that they'll generate in order to make that definitive diagnosis. And so we can use things like high performance liquid chromatography, or HPLC, in order to make that diagnosis. And here we've got a graph that shows how different types of hemoglobin can be separated from a single sample. Now, we all have different types of hemoglobin within our blood. We don't just have one type. And we have expected types, and we have which are developmental, and we have unexpected types, and sickle would be one of those because it's a mutant, it's abnormal. And so we can measure the amounts of the different types of hemoglobin there, and we can ask students to interpret the data. So when you conduct a high performance liquid chromatography type test, you get data, and that data comes in the form of percentages, but it also importantly comes in terms of retention times. And those retention times are generally fairly unique for different molecules that run through an HPLC machine. And so what I would ask students to do is identify which one of these peaks conforms to which type of hemoglobin, F, A2, or S, according to the retention time. And if I just share the instructions with you, they would need to identify what the retention times are for the different types of hemoglobin shown on the graph. And then as an extension activity, they can link this data to the blood film on the previous slide to tell me how one influences the other. So what I'd expect students to do, because we're very short of time now, because I'm talking far too much, I'd expect them to label these. So the retention time is shown on the x-axis, the percentages are shown on the y-axis. So I'd expect the students to say, okay, hemoglobin F here has got a retention time of 1.14. So I'd expect them to label this as HbF. Hemoglobin A2 has got a retention time of 3.68 minutes, which is here. So I'd expect them to label that as hemoglobin A2. And then this big beast over here with a retention time of 4.37 is hemoglobin S, which is sickle hemoglobin, which represents the fact the patient's got sickle cell disease. So I'd expect them to be able to do that. And these sorts of questions really keep students on their toes. They really keep them thinking about what biomedical science is all about, how their core learning of the subject can be applied to these kind of, authentic patients, if you like. Another thing, so I've got a three-parter here. I won't ask you to go through this as time is getting on. But here we've got a patient who's called Jennifer. Actually, let me just share those instructions again. And she's got a mutation in her factor V gene. So this is to do now with clotting. So this is to do with a patient who has thrombosis. So this patient has had thrombosis in the past, and we want to try to identify whether or not she's got a particular type of mutation called the factor V Leiden mutation. And it's so called because it was a mutation that was identified in Leiden. And so what I would ask the students to do here with this very brief little piece of DNA sequencing is to provide the DNA code for the image that's shown here. So what I would ask students to do is, taking this to be position 1683, I'd ask them to read this DNA sequence. So in short, they read from 3' to 5'. They'd say C, A, T, A, G, G, A, etc., etc. So they just read down according to the column, according to the distance from 3' to 5'. And they would write that sequence down in that column, in the table on the right-hand side. So that would be part one of this three-part series. What I then ask them to do is to then think about how you would identify if this factor V Leiden mutation were present or not. And one of the ways that we can do this, and this is only one, there are lots of different techniques that we can use to identify whether there are DNA mutations or not. But this particular approach fits nicely with some of the academic material that we teach in one of the other modules that one of my colleagues teaches. So I use this as an example. So we've got restriction enzymes, and we've got 5 different restriction enzymes here, and I give them the students the recognition sequences for each of those restriction enzymes. And what I want the students to do is to identify from the DNA sequence that's here. So the 3' to 5' is the sequence that they've interpreted from the previous slide. I've given them the complementary code that goes on the other DNA strand. If you think the DNA has got 2 strands, a 3' to 5' and a 5' to 3', they come together and they link together. So I give them that code. And then what they have to do is they need to identify from that sequence there, which enzyme could be used to cut DNA at a particular point. And so I might give them, 3 or 4 minutes to just use a drawing tool to identify on there what area that recognition sequence would be and which enzyme would be involved. And so that's the drawing tools. Then I move on to the writing tools. And so for part 3, the final part of that particular case is the interpretation of an image. So students should have identified that MNL1 is the correct restriction enzyme that they could use to digest that area of interest on that DNA sequence. And then I give them this slide here. And what they need to do is they need to put all of this together and interpret from what they know what this image on the left-hand side shows. So if I look at the right-hand side, first of all, we've got the wild type. This is the normal sequence that you'd have in a normal individual that doesn't have factor V Leiden. And here we can see that recognition sequence for MNL1. And then the mutant over here has got a point mutation, which is represented by this A and T. And that removes a point at which this MNL1 can cut DNA. When it's intact in the wild type, you'll get on electrophoresis a particular type of pattern where DNA will be cut up into chunks of 67 base pairs, 163 base pairs, and 37. And you can see those listed there. And when you've got a patient that's got a mutation, they lose one of those cleavage sites, and therefore you end up with different size bands. And when you use electrophoresis to separate those out, you can tell whether a patient has got 2 copies of mutant DNA, whether they've got 2 copies of normal DNA, or whether they've got a combination of 1 normal and 1 mutant. So they're what we call heterozygous. And so again, we can use Nearpod to get students to think about that and then to write down their answer and then share that with the group. And we're not talking about, long protracted answers here. We're talking about pretty short answers that are punchy, to the point, and can be shared with others. Moving on very quickly, I am incredibly aware that I promised Zach that I would be done by 1:45, and I've broken my promise. So I'll just share a couple of other things that I might ask students to do. So again, looking at Jennifer, if I share this image, we've got an example of a compression ultrasound. So this might be one of the ways of identifying whether a patient's got a deep vein thrombosis. So in images A and B, we have a normal patient where they've got no DVT or deep vein thrombosis. And you can see that pre-compression, you can see an artery and a vein in close proximity to one another. And post-compression, because of the architecture, the structure of veins, they get compressed, they get squished. And so you kind of lose sight of them using compression ultrasonography. Images C and D then below are from Jennifer. And what we can see here is the artery and the vein, pre and post, are readily visible, and we can visualize them. And so consequently, we know that there must be something within that vein that's propping it open to prevent compression happening. And that thing that's stopping it from compressing is a thrombus, is a blood clot. And so what I'd ask students to do is to interpret that and talk about what the image shows, and then as an extension activity, explain how Jennifer's images can be used to indicate if she has a deep vein thrombosis. So I'd expect a little bit of free text there in order to support that answer. I'll use questions such as, a patient has provided consent for you to write a scientific article on his disease. I'll give them an image. This is a picture of a bone marrow trephine that shows a follicular infiltrate, a nodular infiltrate within the bone marrow. So a patient's got a cancer that's infiltrated in this kind of nodular pattern here. And I would expect students to write a very brief legend that they could use, as practice maybe for their final year project when they're writing legends for data, just to get a feel for how to write a legend, how to describe an image in an appropriate amount of detail. I might, as part of the process, give them some cytogenetic information and some fluorescence in situ hybridization. So this is about genetics now. And I might get them to look at the data that's presented to them and compare and contrast what those images are showing. So there are lots of different applications that we can use using a variety of different tools in order to make sure that students are able to take a deep dive into their subject and are able to apply the knowledge from those recordings into these clinical cases. What I'm going to do is, because I'm very mindful of time, I'm just going to skip through. I'm going to possibly make you a little bit seasick while I just skip through a couple of slides just to get to this one here. And what I just wanted to really say is to summarize the 6 benefits in my mind of how I use Nearpod and of using Nearpod. First and foremost, I think, particularly in the context of hyflex, is that it's geographically, it's technologically agnostic. It doesn't matter where in the world you are. It doesn't matter whether you're in the same room as me, whether you're in a hospital in, down the road from me, or whether you're in another country. You can engage with Nearpod, as we are now, in real time and have the same kind of experience of those students that are face to face. I can use it to get students to decode exam style questions to make sure that they can understand what the question is asking of them, and to get real world practice of applying their knowledge to these different scenarios. I can get them to extend their knowledge, to practice their application of their knowledge in these kind of clinical scenarios, and also to revise as well. Every session is a formative session, and that is fantastic. Although students don't necessarily recognize they're receiving formative feedback, I guess from module questionnaires and national student survey, it's important they do know they're getting formative feedback. Oh, they know how to label it, but in reality, whether they know whether they're getting formative feedback or not, they are getting formative feedback, and it is developmental in process. It allows me to reinforce critical pathways to understand how patients are diagnosed, how they can be treated. It puts context into the academic subject matter. And finally, providing you explain it to them in advance, they are dealing with me in a safe space. I make it very clear very early on. I reinforce at the beginning of every session that there's no such thing as a silly question. There's no such thing as well, actually, there are such things as silly answers in all fairness, but we don't reinforce that. We make sure that students feel comfortable sharing their knowledge and maybe their lack thereof, and we do something positive with that. There's never a time when they're going to be ridiculed by anyone within their environment for getting the wrong answer. We use it as a developmental tool. And again, Nearpod is absolutely fantastic for allowing us to be able to do that in a protected kind of data privacy, guided environment, I guess. So those are my benefits of using Nearpod. And this is the main way in which I've engaged with Nearpod throughout my recent academic career, at least. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share with you now a Collaborate board. So I'd be delighted if you could pop any thoughts or questions that you have in there. I think there have been some questions that have popped up potentially within the Q&A and the chat as well, which I think Zach is probably going to go through now. But any other thoughts or questions that you have, please do share them within here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gavin. This has been extremely informative and insightful. We do have a few questions that I've been kind of pinning to a personal Collaborate board here. So the one was just posted there. Louisa asked how exactly you give feedback to the learner or mark their work.
Okay, so I mean, it's all about dialogue. So I'm standing there, I'm sharing the slides with them. I'm sharing the example answers or an example. To be fair, if there isn't an example that is appropriate for one reason or another, not because of bad language or anything like that, but just because maybe it takes me a little bit off the story that I want to go to, then I might not share one. I'll just talk them through a summary of what I've seen. But the feedback comes from me verbally. And of course, anyone who's watching the recording of that session will get that feedback as well. So it's all done in real time based upon what they've written there and then.
Great. One other question I wanted to bring back up because it was in the depths of the chat at this point. Alice asked, have you found the full 120 students join you in a live session, or is the cohort split between student-paced and live session?
Okay, so every student will have the opportunity of joining the live session. In reality, not all do. And certainly we found that, you know, particularly since returning face to face, attendance is not perhaps as good as it could be, and we've certainly seen that attendance has dropped off over the last few months. I think, you know, even if you're dealing with students remotely using Nearpod, which is what I was doing all the time during lockdown, all of my lectures when I was completely remote and we were working from home were based in Nearpod using this approach, and then everyone was remote. And actually we did get a lot of people that dialed in then and you know, logged in. And actually, you know, some people would just say, you know what, I'm just going to answer the question. They'd unmute and they'd speak. Other students would put something maybe in the Zoom chat rather than in Nearpod. And you know, it was a real mix of different approaches that students used that were really, you know, I guess we just allowed them to be as comfortable as they wanted to be and to use the tools they wanted. And it worked really, really well.
Great. Scanning through here, one of the other questions I'm seeing on the Collaborate board is, have you used Nearpod for any short online e-learning courses?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, we don't currently offer short online e-learning courses, but if we were to, and there is talk within our department of doing that, then yes, absolutely, I think Nearpod would be something that I would use for that. I've got some plans for the course and how to evolve it, and it does involve, you know, going down that route. And certainly I would work hard to get my academic colleagues on board to use Nearpod in that way, because I think if you get students engaged early enough with it, then actually, you know, they really do benefit. They can see the benefit of it, and then they're more likely to engage themselves, whether they're permanent students or they are, you know, paying for a short chunk of, you know, academic access to something or other.
Awesome. One thing that I just want to note, I'm still scanning through the Collaborate board, but I also just posted back into the chat. If you guys could take a moment and fill out the session feedback form, we would really, really appreciate it. Again, I feel extremely fortunate that we're able to have people like Gavin join us and share their expertise. It's an incredibly unique perspective on how Nearpod can be used. So if you guys want to give a little bit of feedback on your thoughts, we would really value that, so we can make sure to provide more of this if possible in the future. So I just dropped that in the chat. But scanning through here, see if I'm missing anything else. Is the Collaborate board the only board that students see everything everyone else shared? The one I can actually wait. Yeah, go ahead, Gavin.
Zach, go.
All right. The one thing I'll mention here is that this is the Collaborate board's the best place to see this kind of feedback all in one spot in a very concise and kind of like well-formatted way. But for this, the teacher view, when teachers are when they have activities up, such as draw board or drag and drop, or different things like that, where they can see in live time how students are responding, the teacher could choose to share that screen as well. They can also change that screen to being make the students' names anonymous, so you'll see just multiple live responses from students without having their names listed, just like this. So there are other ways where you can see students engage without it being just the Collaborate board. If a learner logs in on a single screen, do they have to switch between the Zoom link and the Nearpod slides?
Yes, yeah, they do, don't they? And when we're sharing other information with them, they do need to. And so part of the first series of sessions is all about getting them to become comfortable using, this kind of, I guess we used to call it app smashing. I don't know whether that's a thing anymore, using different tools together in different ways. It's probably not called app smashing anymore. I'm probably showing my age now. But yeah, we used to spend some time, getting them to get used to the technology and understand how to switch between tabs and other things as well. And actually, whether we've got degree apprenticeship students who, from my experience, tend to be much more kind of older, well, not much older, but they tend to be older, more widening participation perhaps. They get the hang of it just as easily really as the younger students who use technology all the time. Ultimately, I think it's because not many of them have used Nearpod before, and so they're kind of all in the same boat and they're learning together. But once they've got it, and then they can just apply it across the board to whichever academic within the faculty is teaching them using it. So I think definitely spending some time, just giving them time to explore. And certainly when I set my first few questions around my clinical cases, I give them more time for the first one so they can learn how to explore than I do a little bit later on when time kind of runs away a little bit, and so we shorten the time frame for waiting for answers a little bit. And I mean, I saw there was a question about what about when students hold you up, and ultimately I give them I could use a countdown, but I just do it verbally rather than anything else, and I just say, okay, 1 more minute and then we're going to move on. And those that do share will, and those that don't, well, they still get to benefit anyway, because I'll still talk through answers with them and make it a dialogic process regardless. So even if they haven't had time to contribute or they haven't wanted to contribute, they'll still learn something from the process anyway. But obviously the more the merrier, and it allows me, when they do contribute, the opportunity to get a sense check of what they understand and what they don't understand, and where I might need to kind of put more scaffolding or reinforcement into to make sure they understand the subject properly.
Great. Okay, it sounds like we have time for maybe one last question. We're officially at that hour mark. So if people need to jump, that's totally fine. We'll record, this is recorded and we'll be sharing this out. But the one last question I wanted to check in on was in regards to actually another EdTech tool. So this one's specifically Kahoot, but maybe you could even speak to other tools. So have you used Kahoot in any of your lessons, or have you used any other EdTech platforms for that matter and integrated it into Nearpod itself?
Actually, no, I haven't. But my colleague, Tom Langston, who's going to be presenting next week, has done. And I think he uses things like Padlet within his. And I think Tom will be talking about that next week. But no, I've not used that approach, although that's something I'd be happy to experiment with. I'm very happy, and I love experimenting with EdTech anyway. But that's not an approach I've tried, so I must do that.
Yeah, and that's actually a perfect segue over to Gavin, or sorry, to Tom's session next week. So Thomas Langston, he's the one of the EdTech admins from the University of Portsmouth. He's one of our main partners at the institution, and a pleasure to work with. He'll be presenting next week from more of an admin and education technology perspective on using Nearpod and other tools for curriculum design and course design. So definitely join that session as well. We'll share out invites for that. But just want to call out one last time if you could please fill out that session form. It'd be really fantastic. We greatly appreciate it. And Gavin, we just want to thank you one last time for, again, sharing your expertise and your perspective. Everyone, as you can see from this collaborate board, really valued and appreciated your time and your perspective. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thanks, Zach, for inviting me, and Saris as well. And I'd like to thank you all for attending. I really appreciate so many people coming along on a Wednesday afternoon. Well, for me, Wednesday afternoon anyway. It's been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of your week. And if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to myself directly, or even Gavin or the Nearpod team. We'd be happy to help.
Oh, absolutely. I've been more than happy to receive questions and comments and ideas as well. And I'm on LinkedIn, and you can find me on there as well. So please do get in touch. I'd love it.
All right. Thank you, everyone.